Companion planting, I feel like, can be a very general term sometimes. And when you see charts on the internet or you Google search companion planting, it's not always very helpful because sometimes you'll get like, oh, carrots and tomatoes really like each other. And you see these two plants and you don't necessarily see why. And so they can be a little bit anecdotal. And so with a chart like this, you get a mix of things. And companion planting could be something from one plant supporting another plant as it grows. That's a companionate relationship, even if it doesn't necessarily increase the yield, like with the corn and beans, that helps each other. Could also be pest repelling. One plant helps the other plant repel. One plant maybe feeds the other plant by exuding something in the soil the other plant likes. So when you get charts like this doesn't really help you learn why. Why is it that this plant works well with this other plant? And I see here on this chart, it is helpful because you see that corn and beans, all the beans have little smiley faces. And that's clearly, you can see why, because the beans they're nitrogen fixers, they're feeding the corn, and they're also provided a way to go up. But then when you go farther down the row and you see like mustard, you don't really know exactly why mustard and corn might work well together. And I might not be seeing that right because it's really small. But companion planting is a big term, and we're going to talk more in this presentation about the non-anecdotal. So really what's based in science and the tangible, like what plants really will help each other. We're not going to just say onions and I don't know. We're going to really learn why. So, and here's actually a little example of a mini companion garden. There you've got, in this container, you've got some flowers, which are attracting pollinators. You've got a lettuce, which has the function of something that you can eat, but also keeping out weeds. And then here you've got a broccoli or some other brassica that's going to get taller, but right now it's getting, it's going to grow taller, and then the lettuce, once that's done, is kind of like succession-wise. We'll get to succession. Anyway, here we are. So why would you companion plant? We touched on some of this. The pollinators, bringing in the pollinators, and also the beneficial insects that are going to predate or eat the aphids and the cabbage loopers and all those other things. But also saving space might be a good reason to do this. Any other thoughts as to why companion planting could be a good idea? It's all in one spot. Yeah, so that makes it a lot easier. Makes it a lot easier. And it also makes it easier in the sense that you're sometimes doing a lot less work because you're not going out and trying to kill all the aphids necessarily every day. It might even be less water for you. If you've got something like the lettuce mulching the bottom, grouping like plants together helps save water and food, if you're going for that. So before we start, we'll go over some pesticide usage facts, because pesticides and when we're talking about beneficial planting, why to do companion planting? This is a big part of it. So pesticide is an all-encompassing term that includes herbicides, insecticides, and any other chemical that you might use in your yard to kill something, fungicides, etc. So just some fun facts. About 50% of lifetime pesticide exposure occurs during the first 5 years of life. And just people who are more susceptible to pesticides or chemicals in their system are going to be young people, people who are sick, pregnant, or older. So during those times are when you're most at risk for absorbing pesticides or their effects in your body. Suburban lawn and gardens receive more pesticide applications per acre, 3.2 to 9.8 pounds per acre, than agriculture, which has an average of 2.7 pounds per acre. So we're kind of the starting ground for all of this. It's important to reduce usage. Organophosphates, which are a type of pesticide, a category, a class, have been linked to higher rates of ADHD in children. And for whatever pesticide, you'll find some sort of link to health issues. And in just March of this year, fun fact, the World Health Organization designated the key ingredient, glyphosate, in Roundup as a probable human carcinogen. So the benefits of by employing the right plant, right place, methodology, integrative pest management, and water conservation strategies, you get more food in small spaces, fewer pests, more pollination, less work, water bill savings, and might even work out a lower cost too. So let's start with right plant, right place. Have you guys heard of that term before, right plant, right place? No? How many of you have? Quite a few of you. I think there's even a handout back there probably about right plant, right place. It's been circulated for a little while. But the main instance of, or inspiration for right plant, right place is the forest. Look to the forest, because the forest is the pinnacle of succession, or plants in relationship with each other that are working with each other to create a contained system where everything that they need is all there. So looking to the forest is kind of like our inspiration. And that's what permaculture, if you've ever heard of permaculture, is all about in ideology, is looking at, these are our inputs into the system, these are our outputs. How do we optimize what we already have to create less work, but also to optimize the function of food? We want food. This is what we want, generally. So this is an example of a forest garden and the different categories that you look to. So, and this isn't not necessarily going to apply directly to a vegetable garden, although it could in certain ways if you apply it. So you've got the canopy layer, which is your large fruit and nut tree, making shade, making space, taking up space. And then below that, you've got your lower tree layer, like your dwarf fruit trees, maybe 8 feet tall. And then below that is your shrub layer. So in the forest, that would probably be salmon berries, vine maples even you might consider this part. Blueberries in an edible garden. Then you've got your herbaceous layer, which is directly above the soil. And that could be something like comfrey. This is most vegetables. Tomatoes would be this sort of layer. Those guys are at about this height to this height. And then you've got your, what do they have next? Rhizosphere. So the vegetables or plants that grow, or their edible parts, are mainly under the ground. So that could be beets, carrots, dandelions, even if you're growing dandelions for their root. They could also be considered a lot of other things too, though. And then your ground cover right here. So in the forest, you might see that as like a kinnikinnick creeping in the forest. In your vegetable garden, that might be more like a strawberries or nasturtiums or something that's going to help keep out the weeds, and it also act as a living mulch. And lastly, you've got the layer, which not all gardens have, but the vertical layer. So what brings everything back up to the top, and that's the vines. So that could be beans in your garden. That could be wisteria in an ornamental garden. Don't do wisteria, that's a terrible plant. But right up here, going up to the top. So think of this as your inspiration, the forest. So right plant, right place, you're looking at what does each individual plant need. Do a little inventory. So first, what are its sun requirements? Does it need full sun? Does it need like 8+ hours of sun a day? Or does it something that needs maybe more like 4, like a lettuce? How much sun am I going to need to allot to it? Then you're also going to want to look at your soil pH and texture. And doing a soil test is a great way to start, because then you know what you've got. Texture, of course, is a little bit different than doing a soil test, but if you can feel if it's clay or sand or loamy, a nice mix in between, that is helpful to know, because some plants will like certain things that other plants don't. Like when you're looking at rosemary and lavender, those are all more of a sandy soil loving plant. But if you were to plant lettuce next to that, it would absolutely hate it. It wants more of the loamy, nutritious soil. So taking into account what each of your plant wants before you decide where you want to put them. And this will help you figure out relationships too. Water needs. This is actually a beautiful drought tolerant garden right here. And you've got helenium here. That's this beautiful plant. You've got, no, sorry, that's Rudbeckia. Rudbeckia. And then you've got Echinacea, the coneflower back here. I'm sure many of you have seen Echinacea before. It's a really popular drought-tolerant plant. There's yarrow in there, I think. Some drought-tolerant grasses. So grouping plants together that have the same need serves great functions. It's a good thing. Light, and I feel like that and sun exposure kind of go together. Pollination needs. So does your plant the tomato, or no, what's an even better one? Squash. Does your squash need bumblebees? Yes, yes. Lots of bumblebees. So what plants have the function of attracting bumblebees? Which flowers attract bumblebees? Which flowers attract honeybees? Which flowers attract hoverflies that are going to parasitize and eat the aphids that are on your lettuce? Looking into pollination needs. We'll get to the other stuff. Next, looking at shallow and deep rooting. So this is looking at vertical space under the ground that you can't quite see. And this will help with being able to plant things a lot closer together. So something like here, this is a great chart. This is 1 foot right here. And these are lettuce roots. Then over here, this is 1 foot for scale. And these are carrot roots. So the carrot clearly is going mining for nutrients a lot deeper than the lettuce. So root space-wise, the lettuce might even take up like this much space next to the carrot. They would do really well together, space-wise. They're going to work out. They're going to be friends. If it was carrots and I feel like tomatoes, their roots go pretty deep. That might not be the best, most harmonious relationship space-wise and nutrient-wise. And here's a nice little example of some lettuces and carrots planted together. Short and tall growing. So this is the same thing, but visibly. And because you're dealing with sun, this is going to be a layer that's going to help you create little microclimates within your garden where maybe the shade-loving plants can hide behind the beans. Planting things like, so if you had lettuce is pretty short, like I was saying, and then you've got peas over here in this picture. And if the sun were, for instance, coming from this side, then all these plants, like the chard and these little lettuces here, are going to get a lot of shade, which is great. And then the peas will get the sun that they need, the light that they need to create peas. Here, this is another instance I really like. This is a little cucumber trellis. It's a little arch. So cucumbers are growing over the top of it. And then you've got lettuce underneath because they're going to stay short. And the cucumbers, they love light and heat. As they grow, they're going to create shade over the top. They're going to create a little tunnel for the little lettuces. It's going to stay nice and cool. And lastly, these people were very innovative, and they trellised up their tomatoes and pruned them very strongly. I don't know if you can see that there, but these are all tomatoes. And then down here are these big cabbages, short guys. And they, by being low and by their roots, are going to help keep the moisture in the soil below the tomatoes. And the tomatoes, in turn, can grow tall and get all the sun that they need. So together, they're optimizing their sun exposure. You're getting double. Instead of just planting a whole ton of tomatoes, and you may not get as much ripening from your tomatoes as opposed to having something else in between that can get the lower levels. That makes sense? Perfect. Different harvest times. So this is looking at height, or that sort of spectrum in the time spectrum. So with this one, we already talked about this, but the Brussels sprouts or broccoli or whatever the brassica this is going to grow big a little bit slower than the lettuce. It's got a shorter harvest. Lettuce has a shorter season. And so you can harvest the lettuce and then you'll have space for the leaves of the collard or the brassica as it grows to eventually expand and take up more space. Whereas in the violas, this whole time, the little violets, they're going to stay fine down there. They're going to appreciate the shade. And over here, this is a little hard to see, but it's a really good example. This is parsley, these little green clunks here. It's parsley in its second year. Do you guys know that parsley is a biennial? Biennial. So that means that it lives for 2 years, like a carrot. If you let a carrot go for 2 years, it's going to flower its next year. And then it's going to be done. It's going to go to seed. It's going to make more. And so on its second year, the parsley is making these beautiful, beautiful umbel flowers. They used to be called umbellifera, their family, but now they're Apiaceae. And these attract small beneficial insects that are mainly predatory insects. So they're great, they're important. And then here are these tiny little cucumbers right here. And so this is their first year. They're going to be growing up the trellis, and then these parsley, as they're flowering, are going to be bringing in the arsenal of insects to help keep them healthy. So working together. And you can still eat parsley in its second year. So there's that function too. Then going to building soil. How could plants help each other build soil? Because soil is where it's most important. Nitrogen fixation. So the nice lady in the back mentioned that they could exude something that would help a plant next door to it. Nitrogen fixation, which I'm sure you've heard of before, is the what beans do. It's what peas do, and actually quite a few other plants. It's a process called a symbiotic infection, where actually bacteria colonize the roots of a plant, and you start to see these little nodules if you take them out. There's these big lumps. They look like little marbles almost. And that is where the bacteria has grown inside and expanded the root. But the bacteria, what it's doing is it's taking nitrogen or nitrate, I think, from the atmosphere, and it's converting it into ammonia, which is the form of nitrogen that a plant can use. So, and it also creates nitrates as well. So the two things, this all happens in the little nodule, are then brought immediately into the plant system. And if there's any extra, it's just going to kind of be in the general vicinity of the plant. So this bacteria actually makes atmospheric nitrogen available to plants in the soil. It's really important. So it's a kind of like a parasitic relationship, I guess, a bacterial infection, but it's actually helping out the plant and helping it to live. So that's a companion relationship in itself. But when you take that to the spectrum of soil building, that actually will help other plants who need nitrogen, because nitrogen is the nutrient that helps a plant to grow all of its green, leafy, above ground foliage. That's what its main function is. So plants that will create nitrogen fixation are cover crops, if you've ever heard of cover crops, like crimson clover, vetch, field peas, and there are many others, but this is just a few examples. Also beans, alfalfa, peas, but actually quite a few other plants like lupin actually is a nitrogen fixing plant. Silverberry, it's a shrub. Elaeagnus is also going to do that. Red elder, that large tree, is a huge nitrogen fixer into the soil. And also, fun fact, mimosa trees, those silk mimosa trees, are also nitrogen fixing. There's a lot of them. If you Google nitrogen fixing plants, there's a lot that are not necessarily in the bean family. So take note. But planting these together with some other plants can actually improve nitrogen for nearby companionate plants. And so that's why in the Three Sisters garden, like we had talked about a little bit before, the beans, if you plant them by the corn, will actually create some nitrogen for its neighbor corn, which is great because corn takes so much nitrogen. It's a grass. It just it needs so much nitrogen in order to grow and to grow those fruits. So green mulch is another way of using plants to build soil, companionate plants to build soil. And this is actually a picture of crimson clover that we saw on our other slide. in its bloom. But growing plants like rye or ryegrass, there's so many others, over the winter or next to other plants, they can either kind of increase the nitrogen, or you can cut them, chop and drop, and they'll also just provide nitrogen for the plants because you're just cutting, like grass clippings essentially. You're cutting, and then leaving them on the soil as a mulch that slowly as it decays is going to feed your plants. So that is another companion relationship, even if they're not necessarily both growing at the same time per se, they're still helping each other out. So here actually is a picture of comfrey. Have any of you seen comfrey before? No? Once you have it in your garden, it never goes away. It makes more. But it's a biodynamic accumulator, which is a word that means it has really deep taproot, like a dandelion, and it pulls up nutrients. It mines nutrients from deep down and brings them to the surface. And so its role is as a chop and drop. You've got all these nutrients, all these minerals that you might not otherwise have. You just chop, leave them, they decompose, and you're feeding your plants. And it, of course, grows again. So you're fine. It's fine. And chop and drop can also work for your plant clippings in the garden, especially if they're not diseased. So if you've got powdery mildew on your squash, you don't want to chop and drop that and leave it because it's just going to proliferate. But if you've got, maybe you're done with your lettuce and it's, for whatever reason, you're ripping it out, you could just chop it or pull it out and drop it as a mulch next to or underneath your corn or underneath whatever. And that's a great way to slowly feed your plants too and keep down weeds. So integrated pest management. What is integrated pest management? Does anyone have any short definitions of it? Nope. Well, it's here. We can just go over it. And I can read it to you because it's probably small. IPM is a sustainable approach to managing pests, combining biological, cultural, physical, and lastly, chemical tools in a way that minimizes economic, health, and environmental risks. So it's a combined, comprehensive approach to pest management that first takes into account all other possible things before using chemicals, and minimally using chemicals, or least toxic chemicals if needed. So it's a system. And that's an important term to know if you're a gardener, because you can go to Google and you can say, aphids, IPM, and then you find pages and pages and pages of what to do organically. Organically is how we would, or the normal person, the lay person would consider it, but IPM is like scientifically how you're going to find all your information. So the basis of most IPM principles is attracting beneficial insects to do the work for you, which I love. So here are some beneficials you'll find in your garden. Of course, you've probably seen this one, this little lady beetle. Have you seen this over here? Yes, yes. So this right here is the larva of a ladybug. It looks really funny. If you see it in your garden, you might be like, what the heck is this? It looks like a little lion, like bumpy lion. They actually eat more aphids than lady beetles do. So encouraging the larva, it's a good thing. And then of course here you're seeing, it's a cool picture, you're seeing the different stages of the cocoon before it metamorphosizes into this beauty right here. Then here, these are ground beetles. They actually eat a lot of slugs. Yep. Slug and snail predators. You want ground beetles. These little guys you can hardly see in real life. This is a very micro picture, but it's a parasitoid wasp, and they love to eat the pollen out of the parsley flowers, all the rest of the plants in the Apiaceae, the umbel family, and they are super tiny. But look what they do. I really wish that you all could see this, but this is an aphid. It's aphid skeleton right here, super tiny. If you've ever seen these little things on your plants, and there's a little hole here. So what it does is it lays an egg on an aphid that's alive. The larva hatches and eats the aphid from the inside out and leaves nothing but a shell. Yeah, a little silver shell. Look for them. They look like little pearls, those aphids. But that is fantastic friend to have on your side, parasitoid wasp. And then hummingbirds actually, in addition to pollinating certain plants, they also eat some insects too. So they're good to have. There's so many more than this slide could put in, but just a few examples. So what flowers will bring them in? There are 3 categories that we go for, and I don't have them listed on here because I wanted to have you listen. The first one is the aster family, Asteraceae. And that includes plants like sunflowers, where you basically have this center and then you've got the petals coming out, Asteraceae. Chrysanthemums are part of that. You've got, what else? Lettuce is a part of that. Calendula is a part of that. There's a ton, but we've got sunflowers here, and you'll see there's a little honeybee on there. They mainly attract the pollinators. That's their main function in the garden. Mason bees, that's a good question. They are pollinators for sure, and they will go for mainly fruit trees is what you're using them for, fruit and what's the other one? Well, I guess fruit, trees, and berries. But they'll also pollinate a ton of other things because they're a native bee. So you're not just getting pollination for your fruit trees. You're getting pollination for a lot of things depending on where you use them. So we can chat about that later too. But yes, native bees are excellent, and they will definitely pollinate more on the fruit tree side of things. And then we've got the Apiaceae family, or formerly the Umbellifera family, the umbrella family. And so there's parsley, fennel, dill, so many. There's cilantro / coriander is another one that brings them in. Angelica. Alliums are great as well for attracting. Here you can see, this is a great photo, you can see on the Umbellifera flower just how tiny it is and how for their tiny little mouths, those tiny flowers are so helpful. And the last one is the Lamiaceae family, and that mainly attracts the predatory insects. So that would be that's most herbs are in the Lamiaceae family because they have that higher essential oil content. And so I've got a picture of lavender here, but pretty much like oregano, rosemary, hyssop, go on and on and on, salvias, thymes, they're all going to bring all that in. Check on time, we're good. So when it comes to IPM, pattern disruption is also another great way to go that's not just attracting beneficial insects, but something, a strategy or a way of planting your plants companionately that could help. So when you look at a monoculture, like if, for instance, I like to use the example of if I were wearing all stripes on my body, if there was something called the stripe disease that came around and started at my feet, I would pretty instantly just be overtaken by the stripe disease. Whereas here, if I've planned and I have stripes here, I've got my stripes planted here, and down here I've got my leather, and up here I've got my black, and up here I've got my maroon, it's going to stop. It can't spread beyond. Or if it does, it's going to get blocked before it gets to the stripes on my face. It's going to stay contained in one area. So pattern disruption is looking at planting things not monoculture, of having a biodiversity, to reduce the spread of fungal, whatever diseases, or pests even, deterring pests by confusing them and not allowing them to take over everything all at once. Slows it down. So, for instance, carrot rust fly, I've got a picture here of these garlic, but carrot rust fly is an insect that is really terrible for carrots in our area. It's terrible. But they really don't like the smell of alliums. Alliums are really pungent. and strong, and they can't stand it. If you plant alliums and then you plant carrots and then you plant alliums, they can't smell the carrots because the alliums are just overtaking everything. So different things to disrupt patterns in your garden. Look for that option, especially if you're dealing with a particular pest. If you already know that you've got carrot rust fly, then you've got to think about what can I do to disrupt them. And here's just a cute picture of a little bok choy and a sea of lettuce. I don't think that's a whole bunch of disruption, but it's cute. And then here you've got kale, and then you've got a whole bunch of nasturtium and herbs interplanted together. And that's going to just also help with the same thing, especially I think with aphids in particular. The aphids, we'll get to this in a sec, but aphids tend to really like nasturtiums. If you've ever tried to grow nasturtiums, just because you love nasturtiums, you'll notice that. But so they also like kale, and so by planting the nasturtiums there, they're probably going to go for the nasturtiums over the kale. And that's especially true when it comes to beans, which I think is our next slide. Yay! So nasturtiums, beloved, especially by the black bean aphid. So planting a trap crop, like a nasturtium, next to your beans that are getting infested with these black bean aphids is going to mean that they're going to go for the nasturtiums. You've got this sacrificial crop that you're using. And then eventually it's going to get so infected that you're going to have to take it out and replant again. So using it as like a sponge for aphids and then putting it away. Another thing that one of my coworkers suggested is chervil as a trap crop. That slugs in particular, she's noticed, really love chervil in her garden. And so she'll plant a sacrificial chervil in various spots so to save the other plants in her garden that she wants to eat, like her lettuce. May or may not work for you, again with the anecdotes and companion planting, but it's worked for her. Another example is for the sugar ants. Has anyone ever had issues with sugar ants in their garden? All of a sudden, mysteriously, a brassica falls over, like somebody went through the woods and chopped it down. Have you had that issue? That's the sugar ants. They actually go to different brassicas. They love that taste, and they'll down brassicas. So one of my coworkers at the Good Shepherd Center has developed this plan of planting radishes around the edge of her, what was it? I think it was broccoli she was trying to grow. Radishes, and they went for the radishes. They like picked this particular radish was their radish, and they went for that. So her actual crop that she cared about was fine, but she had something to give them, to sacrifice to them. So think about that. Experiment with that in your garden. What's the trap crop, the sacrificial crop? Water conservation is also another wonderful aspect of companion planting. This is a nice little rain barrel, but it isn't properly hooked up, so don't look at that. Zoning, partnering up plants to conserve water. So here, especially if you're looking at using a drip irrigation system, which you're invested in, that takes some time and planning and a little bit of upfront money to invest in a drip irrigation system. You want to plant plants together on that system that want similar amounts of water, because it's not going to do you any good if you have your lettuce and your tomatoes all hooked to the same system, but your tomatoes don't want nearly as much water in the summer as your Swiss chard does. So planting together is convenient for you because you can say, okay, this zone of my garden is going to be for lettuce and it needs this much water. Whereas over here, I've got my tomatoes or my peppers or my eggplant, and they do not need as much water. So over there, it's only going to get water this much time a week. You have more control over the water flow, and that's going to save you more money. Honestly, it's also going to save water, which is also very important. And then partnering up in other aspects. So like here, I'm bringing back the cucumber example, cucumber over the top, zoning. You're creating this zone underneath that's shadier, and that's going to require less water potentially for your lettuce because the soil is not going to dry out as quickly. The water is going to stay there a little bit longer. Also planting drought-tolerant plants. to serve the same functions that you need is going to be helpful with water conservation if that's something that's really important to you, which I hope it is to a certain extent in your garden. So if you need, for instance, a pollinator, maybe you plant, Oregon grape or salal, those are all going to have flowers at certain times of years, and they're also drought-tolerant natives. Oregano, lavender, they all bloom at different times, but they're drought tolerant. And they're going to also bring in the beneficial insects that eat other insects too. So they're also culinary, you can eat them. Other drought tolerant plants, there's so many, but edible ones, they're a little bit harder to find. Aronia is an example of a plant that is edible and drought tolerant. Sea berry, so I have little pictures of them here. This is an aronia right here. Sea berry is right here. And you see it has these big thorns. And sea berries are super high in vitamin C. Really good. Figs are also drought tolerant, coming from Mediterranean. This is Eleagnus, silverberry. And that's one that we mentioned earlier. That is a nitrogen fixer. Good plant. I've got echinacea here, but that's not on the list. Natives, this is an Oregon grape. This is actually a cultivar of an Oregon grape. It's one that blooms much earlier than the native Oregon grape, different time. And then, of course, most of the herbs. So there are options out there to consider if you want to save water but still grow edible plants in your garden. Mulch. So mulching can be a variety of different things, but mulch in general is going to help keep evaporation from happening in your garden. It's going to help retain moisture. It's also going to feed your soil as it degrades and feed the soil creatures that are in your soil, which are going to help feed your plants as well because they're decomposing and making available nutrients for your plants. So there's so many different options. In a vegetable garden, you might not want to go for arborist chips. That would work in other parts of your garden, but maybe not in your vegetable garden. But there's always straw. Straw is a good option, especially if it's not sprayed with clopyralid. Very important. That's a pre-emergent herbicide. And a lot of straw that you purchase may be sprayed with clopyralid. We've had a lot of calls on the hotline before from people who have mulched or did a straw bale garden, and then all of a sudden nothing grew in their garden. So it's really important to ask where you get the straw from if it's been sprayed. And you can ask for like certified organic or just non-sprayed. It's probably going to be less expensive. I know there's a couple places. You can call the hotline. We can tell you where to get it. And that's an example of a non-living mulch. So non-living mulch would be straw, could be leaves, could be arborist chips in other parts of your garden. Could also be chopped and dropped plants, like comfrey here. That's another example of a non-living mulch because you've chopped it. Same with cover crops. Cover crops can work as a green mulch instantly on your plants if you're growing them and then you're bringing them over to other plants, or they could, that would be mulch-wise. That's how they would work. So, and then, of course, there's living mulches. So bringing in, this is a Three Sisters garden example. But you've got the corn growing up real tall to provide the structure. There's beans, you can't see them, but they're growing up the corn. And then the mulch, the living mulch, is the squash. The squash is what's keeping down the weeds and retaining moisture in the soil, shading the soil so it doesn't get too hot. That could be, when we're thinking of the forest, that could be more like strawberries. That could be ferns. That could be kinnikinnick is a drought-tolerant ground cover. That could be so many things. But you can have living ground covers as well that are serving other functions too, potentially. If you're living in a bog, that could be cranberry. Cranberry could be your living mulch. So putting it all together, this is an example of a guild. So we were talking at the beginning a little bit about permaculture. What is permaculture? And how it's kind of plants already put in a system, helping each other out, that's fully contained. It's a contained system. They're getting all that they need there, ideally. So this is actually a picture of a guild that's in function, full form. This is an apple tree, which you can kind of see it. It's up there. They've got comfrey in here. Comfree is going to be there for an accumulation, a mulch, so they're going to chop it down and leave it at the bottom to feed the apple tree. They've got vetch right here. Has anyone heard of vetch? A couple? Vetch. Nope, nope, it is not. It is going to be a nitrogen fixing plant. Nitrogen fixing plant. And it also has little pea-like flowers. So those, yeah, you can see it here. They're like a pea plant family where they're like this, like that. Yeah. So they're hanging out here, and that's going to be something that they're going to want to, before it really starts to flower, they're going to want to take it out. Because with most plants and with cover crops, once they really start to fruit and flower, even if it's a nitrogen fixer, it's going to be using all that energy for its own. That's like with faba beans. When people use faba beans as a cover crop, sometimes they just use all the nitrogen themselves. So chopping them down before they start to really go, before they start to set out their huge pods, is helpful to actually get the nitrogen that you want to your plants. That's how most cover crops have to work. And then you also don't have a weed problem of having crimson clover everywhere. So before something really, really starts to bloom, then you're going to cut it down and give it to your garden. Sacrifice it. There's also here strawberry in this guild. So strawberry serves the function of ground cover. It's bringing in pollinators for itself, I suppose, but also potentially for the apple tree, depending on when it's blooming. But I think the most important thing here is that strawberry is a human attractant. You want to go out and pick your strawberries. So that's going to make you go to visit your apple tree, go to visit what's going on and see, because you being in your garden is the most like pest eliminating possibility there. So if you're there by your apple tree eating some strawberries, you might notice that, oh, something's starting to eat some of these leaves. Maybe I should check it out. Like that you being there at that point is the most helpful tool, because then you can see what you need to do next. So human attracting components are also important. Make you go visit. So potential functions of a plant guild. Permaculture is all about function. That's their main goal. So what is the reason that you're bringing this plant into your guild? What's its purpose? What's its function in this relationship? Do you want your whole guild's function to be food for humans? Do you want it to be food for wildlife? Do you want it to be for both? What's your goal? There's no right or wrong answer, but knowing what your intention is really going to help you figure out what plants to put together, because every plant that's in there, just like if anyone's ever written a screenplay or a play or something like that, every single line has to have a purpose. Like, why is this here? Why am I saying this? So in that same way, every single plant has a reason that it's there. It's there for a reason. So maybe it's attracting beneficial insects. Like maybe you're part of the pollinator pathway and you want to create a beneficial insect guild that's fully contained to bring in honeybees in particular, or to bring in orchard mason bees, whatever it is, and to provide habitat for them over the winter. What's the function of this? Fiber and timber even could be a purpose. Privacy, like this one right here, could be a purpose, totally legitimate. Creating shade or windbreak, which could also be something like this. Erosion control, sensory experience, soil building, like nitrogen fixing, accumulation of nutrients. And you can totally mix and match. It doesn't have to be just one or the other. But really thinking about, with this space, what are we doing? What's the reason? And that'll really help you figure out what plant's the right place for this. And then looking at designing, you're going to go back to those same things at the very beginning. So right plant, right place. What does each plant need in here? How am I going to give them even over the course of time, because a tree is going to start out small, but then it's going to get really big. So are the plants here, are they going to be okay with this much sun right now? Maybe I need to change them later. Is it going to grow? What can I grow here now that's going to do what I need it to do until the tree gets really tall and shades everything out? And then what am I going to plant? Like looking over time at your space, creating a wish list of your functions depending on your needs, like we talked about in the previous slide. Choosing plants that take up multiple layers in time and space, as we were talking about, over the course of years or just over the course of the season. One of them may be an herbaceous perennial that's this tall in the summer and then it's absolutely nothing in the winter. Is that okay? Probably could be, but is that okay with you for your needs? And choosing plants that fill niches, like building soil and providing habitat for wildlife or food for wildlife in the winter. Those are important things to think about, functionality-wise, just for the overall health of your guild. If you just think about producing food and don't think about those other things, it may not be as sustainable. So considering building soil and attracting wildlife will be important.